more escape routes like shelters, so they don't have to preemptively kill their spouse, which is why, by the way, I didn't mention this fact, but the rate of mariticide has fallen more steeply than the rate of uxoricide. So the women's movement has been very, very good for husbands. Because women had options other than the most extreme measure of killing their husband before he kills them and or their children. So that whole Hobbesian escalation nipped in the bud when there's an escape route for women. And also, I think that that social norms are causally effective. That when a man who uses violence in the home was no longer considered kind of the paterfamilias or patriarch, but considered a contemptible creep, I think that has a causal effect. I give an anecdotal example of. In the, those of us who are old enough remember laughing at Jackie Gleason in The Honeymooners when he would shake his fist at Alice and say, "One of these days, Alice, pow," right in the kisser. And we'd all, hysterical laughter. Now it's kind of, you call social services and you do this.
But it was still unthinkable that he would ever hit her, though, right?
Yes, although and part of the humor was that he wasn't man enough to do it, that it was an empty threat. And that's why Alice would laugh it off, that it was all bluster. But even as an empty threat, I don't think you would see that on primetime television now. And I think those, so combined with the muscle of the police leading men away, just the social norms of you're a contemptible thug if you were to act that way, has operated.
Rory.
So you're the bearer of good news, much of which we all are sort of aware of. Things are going well, and you try to account, I guess, for this, what we mostly think of as incredible violence in the 20th century, especially around this First World War, the type of warfare we saw, and then the Second World War, and the genocides we saw, the Chinese and Russian Soviet revolutions. And so you have to kind of account for those, I guess, partly through statistics, partly through sociological explanations of those regimes. And so those trends have to, those aberrations have to, in the curve have to be, in a way, smoothed out for this good news to show a kind of trend. When you think of 20th century history, though, I wonder, couldn't we be sitting here or somewhere else, maybe more rural, saying, instead of saying violence has gone down, look at all these trends, couldn't we be saying, violence would be going down for thousands of years, and then look what happened? I mean, it just seems to me to be pretty easy to think of historical turning points that could have gone differently. The Nazis developing nuclear weapons earlier, management of the Eastern Front in the Second World War having gone different, the United States having been divided between North and South, so no intervention in the First World War, maybe in the Second. And these are just, and so no Cold War with one side, the United States, having a semi-anti-imperialistic ethos. And so, these are, it seems to me, fairly reasonable potential outcomes that didn't come to pass, and they didn't come to pass, seems to me, mostly for contingent reasons, not to do with our, civilizational apps, as Neil Ferguson likes to call them, just, stupid decisions and good luck. Yeah. Jewish physicists ended up in the Manhattan Project, things like that. And so then you would have had a horror show. You would have had 10 times as many people killed off by the Nazis in starvation camps in Slavic countries. Who knows? You wouldn't have had this Cold War, Cold Peace. You would have had, et cetera, et cetera. So you would have had a wholly different aberration. And so I just sort of, how do you, and I know you're aware of this, so how does that affect your message, which seems to be not just a matter of the trends and tracking them, which, I take your word that's but also there's a sort of moral message of the worthiness of the, so to speak, Enlightenment project. It just seems to me it was very thin thread that it was hanging by, and it's mostly a matter of good luck that it.
Yeah, well, it's a legitimate question, but my argument, my counter is that contingency goes both ways, and you could play out in your imagination a lot of things that could have gone a lot worse. On the other hand, you could also make the argument that in the first half of the 20th century, our species had a run of really, really bad luck, and that the contingency worked dramatically against us on a number of occasions. So if Hitler had been gassed a little bit more thoroughly in the trenches of World War I, it's, a lot of historians say World War II would never have happened, the Holocaust would never have happened, and likewise the other disasters. Probably none of the Soviet leaders other than Stalin would have killed even a tenth as many people. That's also been said of Mao. Now you could run the story both ways. How come Hitler, Mao, and Stalin all arose within a couple of decades of each other? Or you could say, well, things like that do happen by the law of averages, and if you replayed the tape, maybe there would have been 2 out of those 3, maybe 1 out of those 3, maybe 0 out of those 3, and history would have, and many sequelae would have been nipped in the bud, such as the development of nuclear weapons. So that's not saying that if you could look at the distribution of how the movie could have unfolded, if you could have rewound the tape to 1900 and let it run 100 times, how many of them would have been better, how many of them worse? Obviously, we don't know that, but just that the contingency goes both ways. The more relevant point is that contingency, I think, is a huge factor when it comes to things like wars, like effects that governments can implement. And there, which is why my answer to the question, what could go wrong, I said it's the unknown unknowns at the international stage. Things that are less liable to small external shocks that make a big difference, things that are more systematic and more under our control, there I don't think you get as much dependency on contingency. There I think you do get more predictable directionality. So slavery, for example, where you really can sit down and decide we're not going to allow the government to enforce slave contracts. So slavery, there's still human trafficking, but by any count, slavery, which used to be the rule, is now has been driven underground. Or cruel punishments, or rates of homicide. All of these, there really has been a systematic historical force pushing in one direction. So I think the parts of history that are less susceptible to highly contingent, unusual effects will tend to show this directionality, and then there's less unpredictability when the system is more chaotic. And so that's why I think the underlying forces, even at the international level, barring radical shocks, are toward nonviolence, but there are certain systems that are vulnerable to these shocks.
Do you think technology and warfare, though, is really something you feel confident is not going to lead to incredibly massive violence, specifically?
No, it would be foolish to say that won't happen, but nor do I think it's inevitable, in that there are stories in which destructive forms of technology have been put back in the bottle, chemical weapons being an example. I mean, when everyone predicted after World War I that there'd be a huge escalation in chemical warfare, that entire cities would be exterminated by poison gas dropped by airplanes. There were all kinds of Armageddon scenarios in the 20s and 30s. But poison gas was rarely used after World War I, not used in Europe, and now it's being eliminated. Could that happen in nuclear weapons? Well, the proposal's on the table. There's the Global Zero Plan from Kissinger and Schultz and Perry and Nunn and all the Cold War hawks. Again, it would be naive to say that they're going to succeed, but that is one way in which the movie could run from here.
I'm sorry, I haven't read your book on human nature, but I'm wondering if you have what you think, maybe on a very deep level, the concerns of human beings are, in the sense of what replaces or what takes the place of all this energy that went into violence, or that the violence was an expression of. In some sense, you could say one theory could be that violence or a concern with honor is funneled by a hope for something, that there's more to life, that it can't be this, there's something really to defend, or there's some perfection to be had, or something to strive for. Is this all commerce now, or is this like inventing the more apps for the iPhone and making it smaller? I'm wondering, how is this funneled? I'm taking violence seriously in the sense that it might be driven by a very complicated longings in the human soul, not just a superficial desire for power. Things like that are also always factors, but there seems to be something more. So what are we after today? What's taking the place of what's been
Yeah.
so
Well,
much taken off?
I don't think that violence is an outlet for a certain amount of psychic energy that has to find its release. I don't think that that's the way the brain works. So I don't think that, or that has to be stoked up, nurtured, that unless you're roaring for a fight, you won't be able to get out of bed in the morning and do anything creative or productive. If or as rates of violence go down, if they do, I think that all kinds of quite ennobling pursuits, such as let's eliminate infectious disease, let's try to combat hunger in the developing world,
But
let's
those
try
are
to
all
figure out how the
pursuits
brain works.
Of what today people would say are elites, that those are like academic, that happens at top level research institutions. What about all the rest?
Well, I think people are, I don't think it's just the elites that felt pleasure and purpose in the American Civil Rights Revolution, in the conquest of polio, in people landing on the moon, in having unlimited supply of music in your shirt pocket, and the idea that we've eliminated smallpox, we're almost eliminating polio, that we could lengthen human life. Those are, that we have photographs of the outer planets and the rings of Saturn, that we have theories of the origin of the universe. These are things that can be appreciated not just by elites, and I think they are appreciated not just by elites. I don't think it's necessary that you give people their gladiator combats with real gladiators and real bloodshed in order that these energies find release.
George.
A question for you, Professor Mansfield. Would that list of satisfy our profoundest dilemmas?
Well, what about greater justice?
Depends what justice means. If it means that every bad person get his comeuppance and suffer proportionally to the magnitude of his sin, I'm not sure that's such a great thing. It's a matter of disincentivizing other people in those circumstances from creating harm, then that's a good kind of justice.
Okay. One more? Okay, one more here.
What about the gadget of surveillance
Mm-hmm.
in the decline of violence? I've even heard this mentioned in connection with spanking, of which I would consider myself an advocate, although I don't have children. So I do worry that maybe violence might be falling too low, so I wondered, if surveillance could first of all, if you think surveillance has been critical to the decline of violence, and second, in order to bring violence all the way down to zero, what about even more surveillance?
Yeah.
Panopticon society.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I suspect, by the way, that violence won't ever go to zero, but it can get, asymptotically lower and lower. I think surveillance has, in the broadest sense, not just security cameras, but in every corner, which of course you do have, especially in places like England. And that might, I don't know if there are definitive statistical studies that can attribute the decline of violence, say in the 90s, to increased literal surveillance, but certainly techniques to make the Leviathan smarter, like DNA genotyping, may have had something to do with the reduction in the rate of rape. It's harder for bad guys to get away with it,
But surveillance wouldn't be an angel of our nature, right? It wouldn't be something better coming out of us. It
Well,
would
no,
be something
in a sense that,
watching us.
and I've actually used angel in this, in a way to refer to any reduction of violence, even if it doesn't come from motives that sound particularly noble. So, for example, incentivizing commerce instead of plunder. A lot of people think of commerce as morally tainted, but if it keeps us, more consumer goods, more Walmarts and so on, but if it keeps people from each other's throats, I would put that in the category of better angels. Likewise, government and police. What would be more angelic is if we had an age of Aquarius and no one was ever tempted toward violence. But that's not the kind of angel that I would insist on. I have a very nerdy conception of angel, namely, if it makes people better off, that's angelic enough for me. And so for surveillance, if that's what it took, with the obvious proviso that you don't want it to be so tempting to those in power that you get toward a 1984, that is, if you could find the right amount of surveillance, just like we strive for the right amount of government violence. Our police do carry guns, but we don't want to live in a police state. We want enough surveillance that a woman can walk home tonight and not fear being raped, but not so much that Big Brother can go after you when it turns malevolent. So I don't think there's an easy solution, but I think weaving our way between the disadvantage of anarchy, where you can get away with anything, and Big Brother, where it's the government that's the menace, I see that as the human condition. And we're kind of blundering our way toward getting a little better, if not perfect.
That's a good point to stop. That's been great, and thank you so much.